Welcome to the lecture on Part 3 of Chapter 1 of John Rawls's book, A Theory of Justice. I'm Andrew Chapman, and in this lecture we'll be looking at the issue of economic justice, or as it's sometimes called in the context in which we'll be examining it, distributive justice, from Rawls's perspective of a fair end-state theory. According to Rawls, there's a very specific way that economic distributions within societies or populations can end up being just. Thus, we are to imagine that those who engage in social cooperation choose together, in one joint act, the principles which are to assign basic rights and duties, and to determine the division of social benefits. Men are to decide in advance how they are to regulate their claims against one another, and what is to be the foundation charter of their society. Just as each person must decide by rational reflection what constitutes his good, that is, the system of ends which it is rational for him to pursue, so a group of persons must decide once and for all what is to count among them as just and unjust. The choice which rational men would make in this hypothetical situation of equal liberty, assuming for the present that this choice problem has a solution, determines the principles of justice. John Rawls was a 20th century political philosopher who worked for much of his career at both Harvard and Oxford. He's most famous for his book, A Theory of Justice, which we're discussing in this lecture. It would be difficult to overstate the importance of Rawls's work to political philosophy in the 20th century and even in the 21st century. Much of what happened in political philosophy in the 20th century and even today in the 21st century was a response to what Rawls was up to in A Theory of Justice and related works. Rawls's colleague at Harvard, Robert Nozick, wrote a book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, in response to Rawls's A Theory of Justice. Anarchy, State, and Utopia was published in 1974. As you see, A Theory of Justice was published just a few years before that, in 1971. Anarchy, State, and Utopia is taken by many people to be one of the most influential expressions of a conservative and libertarian economic theory, while A Theory of Justice, Rawls's work that we're looking at here, is taken by many to be a paradigm statement of a more liberal theory of economic theory, justice. Since what we're looking at in this lecture is a topic in political philosophy, it's important to remind ourselves what political philosophy is. Political philosophy is the philosophical subdiscipline concerned with the specifically normative or ought-related questions regarding political entities, political powers, and political relations. Some, but by no means all of the questions asked by political philosophers are: what makes something a political state? What distinguishes legitimate from illegitimate states? What grounds political authority and political obligation? For example, why is it that states have the ability to tell people what to do and people are required morally to obey, if at all? What is the proper scope of the political state, both within its own geographical borders with respect to its own citizens and outside of its own geographical borders with respect to non-citizens? What are the conditions for citizenship, both the continuing conditions and the conditions for new citizens? What are the legitimate forms of political government? Are there some sorts of government which are better than others? Are there some that are required? Are there some that are prohibited? And finally, under what conditions can a state be overthrown or dissolved or replaced by a new state? In understanding political philosophy, it also helps to contrast political philosophy with a sister discipline that investigates similar issues but in different ways. This is political science. While political philosophy and political science study the same sorts of things, namely political objects, they study these things from two different perspectives and with two different sets of methodological tools. The political scientist is concerned with the descriptive issues of what states are in their various manifestations, how states and citizens actually do and have interacted with one another. The methodology of the political scientist, then, is historical, anthropological, and sociological in nature. The political philosopher, on the other hand, is concerned with normative issues of how states ought to be, how states and citizens ought to interact with one another, and the reasons why things ought to be this way. The methodology of the political philosopher, then, is philosophical in nature, primarily in terms of philosophical ethics and the methods of philosophical ethics. Political philosophy and philosophical ethics are tightly intertwined. That doesn't mean that they're the same field, although their methodologies are very similar, if not the same. So when we're looking at political science versus political philosophy, the big thing that distinguishes these two is not their subject matter, but the way that they investigate that subject matter and the sorts of questions they ask about that subject matter. What Rawls is concerned with in a theory of justice is, to a large extent, economic in nature. However, Rawls is not primarily an economist. What this shows us is that political philosophers can be concerned with economic issues in particularly philosophical ways. Economics, just like political science, is a descriptive discipline that looks to explain and predict economic phenomena as they actually are or might be. Political philosophy sometimes is concerned with specifically economic issues. However, it's concerned with these issues from a normative, that is, ought-related, often ethical perspective. As you'll see in this lecture, what Rawls is concerned with is the issue of economic or distributive justice, which is an ethical concept. Two of the central economic issues that concern the political philosopher are the issues of justice and fairness in property and the issues of justice and fairness in taxation. To better understand the scope and methods and claims that people like Rawls, who are concerned with the economic issues of political philosophy, are making, it'll help us to understand the concept of an economic distribution. This can sometimes strike students as confusing, but even though there are many different new concepts involved in this issue of an economic distribution, the concept itself is relatively straightforward. An economic distribution is just a way that all owned property is dispersed amongst all possible property owners in a population at a particular time. When time passes or the population changes, we move from one distribution to the next to the next. So let's look at an example of a very simple economic distribution, one in a population of just 5 people. These 5 people are Anne, Bob, Carol, Dave, and Edith, A, B, C, D, and E. So we can see in this economic distribution how things are arranged property-wise for these 5 people. Let's look at another economic distribution using the same amount of property and the same people in the same population. Notice that in this distribution, everybody has exactly the same amount of property. Let's look at one more. Notice that in this distribution, Edith has all of the property. Anne, Bob, Carol, and Dave, they have none of the property. What makes these 3 different things distributions is they show us how the property is dispersed among the property owners in the population at a particular time. Thus, when we do political philosophy and are specifically concerned with economic issues, instead of talking about whether what one particular person or what some particular people have at a particular time and whether those particular holdings of things are morally acceptable, instead, we can simply talk about the justice of entire distributions. So with the distribution that we're looking at right now, where Edith has everything, maybe this is an acceptable distribution, maybe it's not. We don't have to talk specifically about Edith. We can talk about the entire distribution. Is this acceptable or not? If it is, excellent. If it's not, then we can start to inquire into the issue of why isn't this an acceptable distribution? When political philosophers talk about principles that justify particular distributions over others, they talk about these principles in terms of 2 broad sorts, categories of principles. These sorts are known as historical and end-state principles. The historical principles are generally attached to overall historical theories, while the end-state principles are generally attached to overall end-state theories. It is possible, of course, to mix these 2 sorts of principles together. Remember what the principles tell us. They tell us under what conditions some particular economic distribution is just. A historical theory of the justice of economic distributions appeals to historical principles concerning how a distribution came into existence in order to determine whether that particular distribution is just or unjust. The specific pattern of the distribution or the specific internal economic relations within the distribution are irrelevant to historical theories. So if you think back to the distribution we just looked at, where Edith has all of the property and nobody else has any of the property, we can't tell just from knowing that Edith has all of it whether that distribution is just or unjust according to a historical theory of the justice of economic distributions. What we would need to know is how that distribution came into being. The fact that one person has it all and nobody else has anything, that's a property internal to the distribution itself and not a property about how the distribution came to be that way. So historical theories would say, we don't yet know, just knowing that Edith has all of the property, whether this is an acceptable or an unacceptable distribution. On the other hand, an end-state theory of the justice of economic distributions appeals to patterning principles concerning the specific internal economic relations within the distribution to determine whether that distribution is just or unjust. The details concerning how a distribution came into existence are irrelevant to the end-state theory. So the end state theorist can look at a particular snapshot of a distribution at some time and tell you whether that distribution is acceptable or not, because all they have to look at is the particular distribution itself. How the distribution came to be that way is irrelevant to the end state theorist. Rawls's theory, the theory that we're looking at in this lecture, is an end state theory. Rawls is unconcerned with how a particular distribution came to be a particular way. What he's concerned with is what's going on in the distribution itself. Here are Rawls's specific principles that tell us whether, for any particular distribution, that distribution is just or unjust. There are two of them. The first is known as the liberty principle. The liberty principle states that every person has an equal claim to basic rights and liberties. Thus, if you look at some particular distribution, and in the distribution, some people don't have an equal claim to the basic rights and liberties that are afforded to others, there's something wrong with that distribution. Now, oftentimes, just by looking at the economic situation, we can't tell whether the liberty principle is being heeded or whether it's being violated. We would need to look at what's going on underneath the economic situation, the social situation as well. So Rawls's entire theory is more than just a mere economic theory. It's a socioeconomic theory, because you might think that you can't divorce the economic from the social and just look at particular economic distributions. Rawls's second principle is known as the equality principle, and the equality principle breaks into two sub-principles. The first, fair equality of opportunity, says that all offices and positions ought to be open to every person. This equality of opportunity is a right in practice and not just in principle, in that all individuals need actually to be able to hold any office or position for which they're qualified. It can't merely not be illegal for a person to hold some office or position. So you can think back over the history of the United States when certain laws were passed that made things legal. But in order to get around these laws, local officials would make it so that it was nearly impossible for people to obtain the service or to hold the office or position that they were legally entitled to hold. One of the most recent examples of this is that states can shut down abortion clinics even though abortion is legal in the United States, by making it unduly onerous on the abortion clinic to continue operating. So even though the state hasn't made abortion illegal, so it hasn't violated the law, it has been able to make it in practice not possible for many people to receive abortions. The second half of the equality principle is the most famous part of Rawls's EndState principles. It's known as the difference principle. The difference principle says there ought to be some minimal regulation of inequalities in a society, such that the worst off in that society are in the best possible position they can be in. Don't misunderstand the difference principle as saying that the worst off should be the best off. It's saying as the worst off, they should be doing the best they can be. Notice that with these end-state principles, Rawls is unconcerned with how we get to these particular places. He's just saying, look at a society at any particular moment. If any of these principles is violated at that moment, then something wrong has occurred. Let's expand upon the difference principle. Rawls's difference principle is what regulates inequalities, and specifically economic inequalities, although it can also deal with social inequalities in a society. The difference principle holds that the most just economic distribution, the best one, is the one in which the worst off members of the society are doing the best they possibly can be, while still, of course, being the worst off. Thus, Rawls is not against inequality in principle. He's not saying everybody ought to have exactly the same thing. He's fine with inequality so long as that inequality results in the best possible situation for the worst off. Another way to articulate the difference principle is inequality is justifiable only insofar as that inequality gives rise to the best possible situation to the least well off in society. So let's look at an example of the difference principle in action. We'll look at 3 different economic distributions using our friends Anne, Bob, Carol, Dave, and Edith from before. And in these 3 different situations, these 3 different distributions, Anne, Bob, Carol, Dave, and Edith will each have different amounts of stuff, property, economic things. And we'll decide using the difference principle which one is the best, which one is the most just economic distribution. Here's our first economic distribution. There's quite a bit of inequality here. Anne, Bob, Carol, and Dave have about the same amount. Edith has much more. She's got twice as much as Dave has. Now, we can't decide just by looking at this whether it's in line with the difference principle or not, because the difference principle is comparative. It says, look at all of the possible economic distributions and pick the one where the least well off is doing the best they possibly can. Let's look at another distribution. In this one, everyone has exactly the same. Looks like they have some, not a ton, but they've all got something. Let's look at another one. In this one, there's still some inequality, relatively little inequality, but still some going on. So which do we pick? Well, it's difficult to figure that out without getting all of this information together on a table that compares the distributions with one another. So let's do that. Here's our table. We can see what each of Anne, Bob, Carol, Dave, and Edith has in each one of the distributions. And what the difference principle asks us to do is look at the person who's doing the least well off in each one of the distributions. In our first distribution, who's doing the least well off? Well, that's Carol with 35. In our second distribution, who's doing the least well off? Well, since everybody's doing exactly the same in the second distribution, that's everybody. Everybody is doing the least well off. How about in our third distribution? In our third distribution, that's Dave with 25. So what we're comparing is these distributions in terms of which one makes the person who's the least well off in that distribution the best well off overall, the most well off overall. Well, it was Carol in the first, everybody in the second, Dave in the third. Carol had 35 in the first, everybody had 30 in the second. Dave had 25 in the third. So the distribution that we ought to pick according to the difference principle is the first distribution. Even though there's quite a bit of inequality, that's all right according to Rawls, because that inequality is in a distribution where the person who's doing the worst, Carol, is doing the best of any of the people in any of the distributions in terms of that worst person in those distributions. So, in order to be in line with the difference principle, compare all of the possible distributions, see who's doing the worst off in each one of the distributions, and pick the distribution in which the person who's doing the least well is doing the best of all of the distributions. Why the difference principle? Well, the difference principle, says Rawls, originates from this thing called the original position. Rawls's theory is constructivist in nature, which means that the principles of justice in economic distributions arise out of or are constructed by the activities of the very people who are bound by those principles of justice. So it's not as though the principles of justice are handed down from on high. They originate from the very people who are bound to obey those principles. This sounds a little bit like a social contract theory, if you're familiar with social contract theories of the state. However, the difference between what's going on here and a traditional social contract theory is that Rawls doesn't require that we actually all get together and construct the principles of justice. Rawls thinks that any group of rational persons would come to exactly the same conclusions regarding which principles of justice they should be governed by. And these principles of justice are the liberty principle and the equality principle. All people will agree to those two, says Rawls. We can establish the truth of these two principles, says Rawls, via a thought experiment in which we imagine rational persons deliberating over the correct principles of economic justice. In this thought experiment, we imagine the future members of some society that these members will be the population of, deliberating over the correct principles of economic justice as they create the rules for this society. This pre-societal, deliberative, constructive state that these people are in is known as the original position. So the original position is the hypothetical situation in which the people who will be members of a state get together and construct the principles of justice that will govern their state. But there's more to Rawls's original position than that. In order to ensure that rationality and only rationality would influence the forming of the principles of economic justice from within the original position, Rawls has us imagine that the people in the original position, those tasked with constructing the rules of their future society, are behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance is a concept that describes a hypothetical state that a person is in when that person is unaware of any and all merely contingent factors of themselves or of their life. These factors include, but aren't limited to, for example, their age, their physical and mental health, their disability status, their biological sex, their gender, their sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, nationality, level of intelligence, occupation, talents, desires, both personal and family wealth, etc. From behind the veil of ignorance, a person is a mere rational thing. They don't know anything else about themselves. All they can rely on is their rationality. The reason that the veil of ignorance is important, says Rawls, is because knowing any of the contingent factors that actually affect the lives of the people in the original position could influence those people to create biased principles of not really, but quote-unquote justice. People might not even be doing this consciously, but if, for example, you know that you're a member of some particular class, you might, consciously or unconsciously, bias the rules of justice that you come up with such that they end up favoring that particular class. You can't know who you are if what we're trying to do is use rationality and rationality alone to create the best principles of justice, says Rawls. Now, why is it that Rawls thinks that the liberty principle and the equality principle are what will arise out of the original position from behind the veil of ignorance? Rawls thinks that any rational person will always decide on the liberty and equality principles. Since, says Rawls, for any particular person who is in the original position, that person doesn't know who they are in terms of their contingent features and their position in society, that person will want to ensure that no matter what society thinks of people like them, and no matter where they are in the socioeconomic hierarchy, they themselves will be doing at least minimally okay. So imagine that you are in the original position behind the veil of ignorance. You know nothing about yourself except that you are a human person. Well, says Rawls, you'll want to make sure that whoever you end up actually being, whether you end up being very talented or not talented at all, whether you end up liking education or not, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're transgendered, whether you're gay or straight or bisexual or asexual, whatever your race or ethnicity or nationality is, whether you have lots of money or not, you'll want to make sure that whoever you are, you end up at least doing okay. So Rawls is not some starry-eyed optimist about human nature. He doesn't think that everyone's going to get together and just really want to cooperate. He thinks that, purely out of self-interest, people will want to look out for the worst off in society because they themselves could be the worst off. Rawls is less concerned with the very well-off because, well, they're very well off. The very well-off don't need looking after. They're not going to starve to death. The people who need looking after are the people who are doing the worst off in society, and he thinks that any rational person in the original position, behind the veil of ignorance, will set up a society that promotes the liberty and equality principles because those rational people in the original position behind the veil of ignorance will be worried that they themselves will be the worst off. What are some of the implications for Rawls's theory of justice for political philosophy? At a minimum, Rawls's principles of justice require a robust socioeconomic safety net, such that people who are at the very bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy are doing the best that they can be. We can't have merely market principles here. However, depending on the conception that we have of the concepts of rights and liberties and of offices and positions from Rawls's two principles, the liberty principle could require massive intervention into both public and private spheres in the form of what some people might call affirmative action policies. Rights and liberties needn't just be the sorts of things a person has when they're left alone to live their lives. It does seem as though having things like education and healthcare, as well as a stable, socially respectable job, gives a person more freedom than they would otherwise have. Perhaps the liberty principle justifies such massive intervention. Even further, it's plausible that the difference principle requires non-trivial amounts of wealth redistribution. This wealth redistribution would probably occur via some sort of redistributive taxation in which those at the top of the economic hierarchy are taxed in such a way that some good percentage of their taxes is simply given to those at the bottom of the economic hierarchy, either in the form of services and subsidies or just in the form of direct payments. So, when we first look at Rawls's principles, They seem not only plausible, but as though they might not require all that much of us. But they might require quite a bit from us. But remember why Rawls thinks that these principles are justified. He thinks these are the principles that any rational person could assent to if they put their merely contingent biases aside. So as we've seen, there is this tight connection for Rawls between the notions of rationality and justice. Rawls thinks that the principles of justice that ought to be adopted are those that are best supported by rationality. Now, when we state it in this way, could someone really disagree with Rawls? Is there someone out there who's arguing for the opposite of Rawls's position, that the principles of justice that ought to be adopted are those that are not best supported by rationality? Well, maybe not. Perhaps no one is arguing for the non-rationality picture directly. But most philosophers don't start out with the notion of rationality and argue for ethical or political claims from the mere notion of rationality. Many philosophers think that things other than rationality should be what guide our philosophical investigations into the issue of economic or social justice. Perhaps some conception of fairness is what should guide our investigation, or maybe some conception of power, or maybe some conception of community, or family, or religion is what ought to guide our investigations. And if we get rationality as a byproduct of those investigations, all the better, but we shouldn't start out with a mere notion of rationality. So why does Rawls argue in this way? Well, Rawls is a follower of Immanuel Kant, the 18th century German idealist philosopher, and according to Kant's particular ethical philosophy, the moral facts and the rational facts are one and the same set of facts, such that there can be no thing that is morally preferable that is not also rationally preferable. Now, you don't have to be a follower of Kant in order to see why what Rawls is doing is very powerful. Start from all and only the dictates of rationality, and Rawls thinks you get to his particular theory. That's a powerful claim. This is why Rawls was so influential and continues to be influential in political philosophy. People have said a number of things about Rawls's theory, and they're too numerous, too complicated to get into here, but one initial complication for Rawls is this. Most people believe that our economic lives should be structured in whole, or at least in large part, by free and uncoerced market transactions. These market transactions institute, most people think, relations of ownership or private property, such that if you buy something, it's yours privately. And if something is a person's private property, it would be immoral, it follows, to take it from that person without that person's consent. However, even though Rawls's theory is perfectly fine with the existence of market transactions, in fact, Rawls's theory is perfectly fine with any economic system so long as that system respects his two principles of justice. It does seem as though there's an acute tension between the concept of private property and the concept of redistributive taxation. Why is that? Well, if something is mine, then you can't just take it and give it to someone else without violating a moral rule. Thus, the supporter of private property who is also a supporter of Rawls will need some more nuanced theory of private property than the simplistic but popular theory that states that if it's mine, you can't take it. That theory seems to underlie our common understanding of private property, that if it's yours, nobody can take it from you. But we can't have a system with a robust social safety net and perhaps even massive redistributive taxation that results in a redistribution of wealth if your property is yours and nobody can take it from you without violating morality. In this lecture, we looked at John Rawls's particular theory of economic or distributive justice, his theory of what makes certain economic distributions just or unjust. Rawls's particular theory is more than just a theory of economic justice. In order to understand what Rawls says about economic justice, we also need to understand some social things about what underlies the economic in any particular society. Rawls is a constructivist who states that in order for some particular principle of economic justice to be correct, it would need to be the sort of thing that all rational, unbiased people could agree to. In order to figure out what all rational, unbiased people could agree to, Rawls gives us the concepts of the original position and the veil of ignorance, which, when employed correctly, are supposed to strip us of our merely contingent biases, such that we can make rational and only rational decisions about the principles that ought to be adopted. While Rawls's principle is very intuitive in a number of different ways, as we saw, adopting Rawls's theory, Rawls's set of principles, would require that we have a more nuanced view of property and of our relations to one another economically and socially within a society. Thank you.